I'm now talking about the transition from the Declaration to the Constitution. And today we'll be talking in particular about the first experiment or test of a government, which is the Articles of Confederation. And then we'll talk a little bit about the Constitutional Convention of 1787 that produced the Constitution. So let's begin with the Articles. Not too long after the Declaration of Independence, a few years later, the Articles of Confederation were produced and eventually secured enough support to go into effect. And it was the first national form of government that the American people had after the Declaration. The Articles created a government that really had one central governing body, which was Congress. There was no separate judiciary and no separate executive. And the Congress was constructed in the way that you might think it would be if you had a confederation. There's the idea of the Articles of Confederation is something close to a group of officials that really are kind of ambassadors from the different states that make up the Confederation. I mean, you actually sometimes get very loose confederacies in international affairs where the Confederacy is a very weak central government, and all it really does is try to work out some common points of agreement so as to coordinate, let's say, defense against a larger enemy or something like that. Now, the Articles of Confederation, I think, aspired to be something more than that, but the model is fundamentally the same. The center of gravity remains in the states, and then the states send representatives who are representatives of the states themselves to the Congress. And that Congress becomes the governing body, but the scope of its governmental power is quite limited. Not surprisingly, given that the center of gravity is with the states, each state has only one vote. It's not voting proportionate to population. And each state has one vote, and under the Articles, in order to ensure that a bare majority couldn't ram things through, normally it required 9 states in order to approve some resolution or a piece of legislation, although in some ways legislation might be a strong word for what the Articles of Confederation could do. So you have this single central body, Congress, that looks like a group of ambassadors from the different states that requires a fairly high vote in order to get anything done. So that, right from the beginning, that's going to limit the power of the government considerably. Then the powers of government are very seriously limited in ways that made it more difficult for the government to be effective. First of all, you have the whole question of foreign affairs. The Articles of Confederation government did not really have the power to compel the states to pursue a single foreign policy. The biggest issue was the fact that we had made the Treaty of Paris with England to formally end the Revolutionary War, but there was no effective mechanism by which the Congress could make sure that all the states abided by the terms of that treaty. In particular, there were questions about the treatment of the Loyalists, especially the people who had fled the country, the question of the pre-war debts that were owed by Americans to British creditors. And the Treaty of Paris had established certain provisions for the repayment of creditors, for the treatment of Loyalist property. But in some cases, the states just did not abide by the terms of the treaty. Now, that was a really serious issue because it gave the English an excuse to maintain a line of forts on the western border of the United States, which constituted, I guess in terms we use today, a constant threat to our national security. Because remember, you have to put yourself back in the position of the 1770s, 1780s, and we now know that the United States government grew and became very powerful. But of course, back then, there was no guarantee of that. In fact, really up until the War of 1812, there was always a question about whether the English might kind of take up arms again and reestablish their control over their former colonies. So the inability of the Congress to enforce the terms of the treaty in a way that removed the excuse for the English to maintain their forts along our border was a real problem, a serious problem. And it shows what happens when a confederacy is weak and the parts are not able to be controlled for the common purposes of the Confederation, especially national defense. So that's one problem, foreign affairs. A second problem is Congress did not actually have the power to tax directly itself. What the Congress could do was issue a requisition to the states. That is, they would say, okay, we need X millions of dollars, and we're going to divide that up according to a certain formula. So Georgia, you pay this amount, and Virginia, you pay this amount, Massachusetts, you pay this amount, and so forth. Now, the problem is that a lot of the states had financial difficulties during the period between the Declaration and the Constitution. And in some cases, states defaulted on their requisitions. Well, you can imagine what happened. If you're in a state that has, paid the requisition for whatever the particular purpose was, and then you see other states that are not paying for whatever reasons they consider adequate, it might be awfully tempting for you not to pay as well. And that meant that there was constant instability in the financial situation of the new government. The new government couldn't really be sure that it would actually get the money that it needed. So the absence of an effective taxing power is also a problem. And then third, you also have the problem of commerce. Now in this case, it's perhaps not so much the affirmative power of the Congress to regulate commercial affairs. It has to do especially with the elimination of trade barriers among the states. Because Congress could not regulate commerce effectively, because the states were still pretty much free to regulate commerce as they wished, what that meant is that states could tax goods coming from or going to another state. That is, in a way, each individual state could set up duties and customs in the same way that a nation would set up duties and customs for goods going to or coming from another country. And the result was that you had a lot of what you might call internecine economic warfare among the states. Take one example. New York is a major port. A lot of goods enter, perhaps especially from England, through that port, and then they go through New York and they go to other places like New Jersey and Connecticut. Well, of course, you can imagine it would be a pretty great boon to New York State finances if they would establish certain kinds of financial exactions on the goods going through the port to the other states. But you can also imagine that the other states, New Jersey, Connecticut, whatever, would not be very happy about that in effect New York was taxing them. And of course, they didn't have any control over that. That's an example of what some of the states might have felt was a kind of taxation without representation. And so the very possibility of this kind of economic warfare among the states was a source of considerable unhappiness. So for a variety of reasons, you can see that the Articles of Confederation government is quite weak. It's pretty limited. Now, we have to be careful not to overstate this, because the Articles of Confederation did have some fairly significant accomplishments. First of all, the Revolutionary War did end successfully. We won that war. Second of all, the new government did oversee the negotiation of the Treaty of Paris, which formally put an end to that war. Another significant achievement was the Northwest Ordinance. There's a whole bunch of territory especially in the Ohio Valley and into to the Midwest, as well as territory to the west of the southern states. But the Northwest Territory in particular was regulated by the Northwest Ordinance. And this established the conditions for the population of these states, the division of the states into different townships, the organization of the states, and of what would be the future states. And that was really a pretty considerable accomplishment. Again, as we look back now, we just kind of assume that something like this was natural and obvious. But if you put yourself in the shoes of people back then, these original 13 colonies, what's going to happen as with this other territory to the west that's part of the new government? How is that going to be organized? What does it require for states to be admitted? It was a significant challenge, and the Articles really took the first steps to accomplish that goal. So the Articles was not a totally imbecilic, weak government that could not accomplish anything. On the other hand, it was a weak government in many ways, and that eventually showed up in practical ways. In the mid-1780s, there were economic problems in a lot of the different states, and especially a lot of tensions between creditors and debtors. And in fact, in Massachusetts, a Revolutionary War veteran kind of took to the head of what was basically a big mob and headed toward Boston. This ended up being called Shea's Rebellion, and it really was pretty scary at the time. Exactly, how far this mob would go, whether it would constitute outright rebellion, was a serious question, and it really put a scare into many Americans. And part of that problem was the question of whether or not the states could be confidently relied on to protect what the founders often referred to as private rights, meaning especially the rights of contract. If you have a situation where you have, let's say, a lot of farmers, a smaller number of commercial people, and let's say the bankers, merchants, lend money or give goods on credit to farmers, and then let's say there's an economic downturn and the farmers can't pay, and then the creditors go after the farmers to get their pay, or if not their pay, their land. Well, of course, you can imagine the disruption and the tension in society in those battles between creditors and debtors. Well, there were a lot of farmers, which means there were a lot of debtors. And in a democracy, a lot means that often you can get a majority in the legislature. So the temptation would be for the debtors to use their power in the legislature to basically get out of paying their debts in some way or another. That is, that the creditors would be bilked of their repayment. Now, some people view this as simply a question of the haves and the have-nots, and the founders were on the side of the haves. It was much more complicated than that. A lot of the founders weren't particularly rich themselves. I mean, they weren't poor, but somebody like Hamilton could have been much richer if he wasn't involved all the time in government service. But their concern was not simply to protect the rich. Their concern was, what are the conditions for a productive economy? And a guarantee of contractual rights, the fact that you could be confident that when you made a contract it would be fulfilled, was something the founders thought was essential to a prosperous society. And so they were very intent on the recognition of the contractual rights of creditors. And Shea's rebellion and other events at the same time as well raised this question about whether or not the states could really do a good job of protecting contractual rights. So by the mid-1780s, you get an increasing sense among certain leaders in society at least, that the Articles of Confederation had established a government that was too weak, that it was not really strong enough to accomplish the goals that the central government of this new republic had to achieve. And so there was a series of conventions, meetings where different states sent representatives to discuss some of these problems. And then it eventually culminated in 1787 with the Congress itself of the Articles proposing to the states that they appoint representatives to attend a convention. And this convention would have the goal, the responsibility of proposing amendments to the Articles in order to render the government adequate to the exigencies of the nation. So you have this new convention that's called, and their job is to amend the Articles in order to make it more effective, to do what it was supposed to do. The states, by and large, complied with this suggestion from Congress. There were a couple of states that did not send representatives, but 11 out of the states, out of the 13 states, eventually did send representatives to Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. And this was the Constitutional Convention that produced the Constitution of the United States. So they met in Philadelphia in 1787. A lot of their work went on during the day in a very hot, sweltering summer. Of course, a lot of the work also went on at night in the bars as well, where over drinks they had a chance to talk more informally. They met for certain periods of time, then have brief recesses, and committees would do work, and then they'd come back together. And it was quite a remarkable event. There are many accounts of it, and I'd encourage you someday to go and read an account of those events, or even, if you're ambitious, to read the debates of the convention that were put together by a man named Max Farrand in 4 volumes with all the notes attached to it as well. And it's really quite a fascinating event. Now, first of all, the reputation of the framers of the Constitution historically is very high. I mean, people look back and they say, wow, this was quite an extraordinary group of men. And they're right, they really were. Of course, the greatest, the most significant, what one biographer used as the title of his book, the indispensable man, was George Washington. I mean, Washington had an enormous prestige because he had led the Revolutionary War Army and had been, in some ways, the glue that held the army and therefore the country together. There were many people who had been officers in that army who had a deep personal loyalty to Washington. And Washington was remarkable not only in the influence that he had over people, but also as a kind of a great Republican statesman. We look back now and we see Washington becoming president after the Constitution's ratified and serving 2 terms, voluntarily retiring and dying soon after that. And we, in some ways, take for granted the fact that he was willing to to take the office and then to give it up. I mean, look around the world today. Look in some third world countries of the last 50 or 70 years, and where you had people who led independence movements and then became leaders of their country, and then refused to abandon power, and in some cases became despots or tyrants. Washington was a deeply Republican man, committed to the principles of republicanism. And with his personal prestige throughout the colonies, he was an absolutely indispensable person at the convention. He participated virtually not at all. He became the chair, and a silent chair of the conference, of the convention. But that should not lead us to ignore the fact that his presence was absolutely indispensable. I think he only spoke once or twice, especially at the very end. He made a plea for one modification of one provision. But by and large, it was simply the fact of his presence that was the dominant factor. As a group, it was generally pretty young. I mean, many of the outstanding people at the convention were 30, 32, really in what today we'd consider the early stages of professional life. But there was a difference for them. Many of these people had been young men during the Revolutionary War, and war has a way of allowing talent to rise. For one thing, you need talent. You can't afford to have people who are bungling in charge. And so the tendency is that in wartime, people with talent rise more quickly. And so many of these people had played a role during the Revolutionary War. I mean, an example is Hamilton, who had been an aide-de-camp to Washington and who Washington thought very highly of. Although at the end, actually, he left Washington because he wanted to be in on the battle, and he participated in some of the charges at Yorktown. So Hamilton is, again, quite young. Madison's quite young. Madison's quite an interesting person. He actually spent quite a bit of time before the convention doing an independent study. Basically he got together materials to do a detailed study of the history of republics, ancient republics and modern republics. And he drew on a lot of that knowledge as he participated in the convention. You have other people who are very unknown today, but are really fascinating characters. People like Gouverneur Morris, who's a guy with one leg, a peg leg, who is a very kind of irascible and very strong personality. He had some fairly significant influence on the provisions dealing with the executive, and he also is the person who ultimately did the last formal writing of the Constitution, the actual final wording of it. You got people like James Wilson, who was already kind of an eminent lawyer and would go on soon afterwards to write lectures on laws that had a considerable degree of prestige and were known not even just in our country but outside our country. So in a whole series of ways you have really eminent people. One of the interesting things about Hamilton is something that was said about him by a fascinating person named Talleyrand. Talleyrand was a guy who had been foreign minister of France for a long time. He was, he served before Napoleon, under Napoleon, after Napoleon. He was a guy who always managed to somehow stay on his feet as France went from one government to another. So a very talented individual. And he once said that the three greatest men he had met were Hamilton and Fox of England and Napoleon. And he said, of those three, the greatest was Hamilton. Quite an encomium, to basically be said to be greater than Napoleon himself, who was really, the dominant figure of Europe in the very first part of the 19th century. So as I say, if you look back on these men at the Constitutional Convention, they deserve their historical reputation. Of course, it doesn't mean that you didn't have feet of clay sometimes. It doesn't mean that there weren't faults. It doesn't mean that there wasn't a lot of politics, low politics as well as high politics going on at the convention. But as a group, it really was an extraordinary group, and so it's a good reason for us to pay attention to what they did as they put the Constitution together.